Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us tonight Tom Norford. And they're supposed to be clapping. I press the button, guys. I press it every time. Okay. I'm going to just edit it in. It's like a habit now just to edit it in. I've had it edited in like 6 videos now.
It's right.
Nonetheless, you got your round of applause.
I've got a glass of wine. I'm good. I'm happy.
I wish I had a glass of wine, man. This tea, in case people who can't tell, I'm a little bit raspy right now. My wife says it's sexy and that I should be sick all the time. I beg to differ. I don't like the feeling. Anyway, Tom, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where you're from, what do you like to do?
Yeah, sure. I'm from. Well, I grew up in a tiny little village near the town of Rugby, which is the home of the popular game of the same name.
I actually played rugby for give or take 8 years.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, about 5 miles away from where I grew up, Rugby. Yeah.
Cool.
Studied English lit at university. Sort of dossed around in different jobs. Tried teaching, didn't like it. Did warehouse jobs, rubbish jobs. Worked for a while in a bingo hall of all things. Do you have bingo in America? Do you have bingo halls?
Yeah, usually it's associated with old people. They go and play bingo every Friday or whatever.
Yep, same here. Yeah. And this was back in the days when you could still smoke indoors. So it was like it looked like there was a fire. It looked like a London pea super from the Industrial Revolution or something in there. But, I sort of fell into working for Children's Social Services somehow, and I've been there ever since about 15 years later, really.
Well, yeah, your novel. So let's talk about that. The Starved God is what you've titled it, and you've pegged it as an adventure, sci-fi, fantasy, horror. So just wrapping everything all up in there. So tell me a little bit about why each of those genres is in your book.
Well, it's science fiction, I think, because it's plausible. I think it's based in reality. There's no magic. There's no dragons. There's no creatures that wouldn't be able to exist. Like a dragon couldn't exist because the bones. Oh, my cat's just jumped on my keyboard. Hello, cat. So it's science fiction because it's outlandish, but hopefully grounded in some kind of reality, and technically it takes place on Earth. I mean, that's not to say I haven't got some of the science wrong, which I might well have done. So I call it science fiction because of those reasons. But the fantasy element comes from some of the dynamics of it, really, and some of the feel of the book. I think it has that kind of multiple races existing in a low tech world, like a lot of fantasy novels do. Sort of low tech medieval / Viking sort of level of technology, and people going on journeys on a creaky old boat, that kind of stuff, and some monsters that hopefully I think are sort of plausible that could exist. That was my cat's back that you just saw. And the horror.
Speaking of monsters.
Yeah. And the horror is just the horror, really. Violent things happening and a bit of dread, people doing horrible things to each other,
Yeah. So you alluded to it taking place in the future, and it seems reminiscent to me of Time Machine by H.G. Wells. And you mentioned that there's humans that have evolved into different forms. And in his book, you had the Morlock and oh gosh, the
Orloi or something. Eloy, is it?
Something like that. Yeah. Is that kind of the direction you headed?
Yeah. Actually, yeah. I think H.G. Wells sits between sort of all rules are off the table at one end and hard sci-fi at the other end. He sort of sits somewhere in the middle where there's an attempt to make it plausible, kind of thing. And so it's similar in that way, and like I say, the sort of themes of far future and humans evolving into different forms kind of stuff. So
So,
yeah,
what are
yeah,
the
it's a fair
relationships
comparison.
between these different types of humans?
So I think when I sort of conceived of the novel, I wanted to have different species of human, but I thought I had to have one that's pretty much similar to ours, so that there's that hook, so it's a bit more relatable. So the main or default kind of species is very much like us, essentially, apart from one or two little things that really kind of send their culture in a different direction. Because, like, if culture is not totally dependent, but culture is informed by biology, you could say. You know, um, so the humans that are closest to us in the book, because they've been through such hardship as a species, at times they've almost gone extinct. They've evolved this ability to go into torpor, like a kind of hibernation state, which is a bit like a zombie sort of state where their metabolism slows down almost to nothing, and they can just sort of shuffle around and try and walk towards heat and light and vaguely avoid things that are painful until hopefully they can get better, kind of thing. And that relies on, for that to work, it relies on being part of a social species, because you're not going to get out of that yourself. Yeah, anyway, so that's the main species, and that torpor, like I say about the biology informing the culture, it's a religious culture, and torpor is seen a bit like, dare I say, in some cultures at some times, menstruation, women's menstruation has been sort of seen as sinful, kind of thing. This torpor thing in some cultures in the book is a terrible, grave sin. It's like proof that your soul is inadequate to go to heaven. Whereas there's another culture of the same species that see it as a kind of Zen-like state that brings you closer to God, if you like. So that's the closest sort of species to us in this future. But then there's a kind of, have you ever seen the film Descent, British horror film? That sort of,
Don't think I have, no.
no, it's a horror film with humanoid creatures living in caves that navigate and get around by echolocation, like bats. I pretty much stole that, really. So that's another species of human in the book, are pretty much like them, except they're not predatory and evil. They kind of, they're peaceful, and they live off this special fungus that they grow and stuff. And there's one sort of arboreal tree-dwelling species, but which is only discovered later in the book, and they're called the LP. I can't remember how I spelt it now. ELPI, and the name LP came from, like, when I was drafting it, I just called them the lemur people, and as I was writing my notes, I was just writing LP, the letters, and then I decided to call them LP, ELPI. So there's a kind of a tree-dwelling species. But there's also a sort of vampire-like species, and I thought it was a pretty good kind of monster. They this species looks like normal humans, um, but what happens is as they grow older, as they reach puberty, this species, they develop the ability to sort of shoot out these bony spikes from their wrists, and they can open their jaws super wide like snakes and projectile vomit acid kind of thing. And they live among normal humans, just like killing in secret. They have to have raw flesh to survive, kind of thing. But the females, and this probably says something terrible and awful about my psyche, I don't know, but the females transform as they get old, as they reach puberty, and they become more like quadrupedal beasts, and they flee whatever human family is kind of unwittingly hosting them, and they flee and go off to some dark cave or forest to fend for themselves and essentially live like leopards, really. But to sort of just complete the sort of reproduction cycle, the males and the females have a kind of spider sort of setup where the male brings the female a gift, and if she's pleased, she'll let him mate, and if not, she'll just eat him, and she might just eat him anyway. And then when they have a baby that looks just like a human baby, they smuggle it. The male smuggles it into human society one way or another, switches it round with a baby in a family, or drops it at an orphanage kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of revealed in the first few chapters, I think. But
So you
that
have a kind of
species,
cuckoo bird thing going on here. The cuckoo bird. I think the parent like puts the egg into a nest, and then
oh,
when
the
the nest
cuckoo,
hatch, when the egg,
cuckoos,
yeah,
yeah.
when that bird hatches, it pushes all the other eggs out. And so, where'd you get all these crazy ideas? Because these are very, I've never heard these before. They're very fascinating.
Um, a lot of the book came from a fascination, I suppose, with evolution in general, really, and Richard Dawkins' books, particularly. I read most of those, I think, his popular science books about evolution. And when I sort of decided that it was going to be a far future book, and that humans have evolved, the sort of basis or a requisite for animals to split into different species is some kind of isolation kind of thing. So, if there's a small population who end up living in a forest, it stands to reason that they'll evolve to be able to
Yeah,
survive in the forest better. So, they might long arms, fur, whatever, and
yeah.
the ones down in the cave. But I started thinking about a kind of whether it's possible to have a kind of social isolation. The kind of, you've got a small population of humans trying not to starve in some rotten little patch of earth somewhere, and the 2 or 3 psychopaths in the group kind of socially isolated, and maybe they could kind of develop off on their own somehow. That was probably the shakiest bit science-wise of the book, I should think, where I was not entirely sure that was plausible, but maybe it is. I don't know. But it's a cool monster. I think it's a cool monster, and we really, at some point, we really get in his head, because I don't know if you've ever heard of the Chinese room thought experiment. I guess
No,
not. It, I think it might be sort of relevant to AI and stuff. It's about how you'd be able to tell if AI was truly kind of sentient or not. And it's actually referenced in the book, but in a different way, kind of thing. So you imagine there's a room, you're trapped in a room, and someone is passing notes to you under the door, but they're in Chinese, and I assume you can't read Chinese, so, and you're
good
expected,
assumption.
yes, and you're expected to write a note back, but you've got no idea what these notes are saying. But in the room with you, there's a thick book with tables and tables of information and their instructions. And so all you have to do is look at the note you've been given through the door, look up the symbols in this big thick book, and it will tell you what symbols to write down, and then pass your note back under the door. And so if you keep doing this, you could have a whole conversation with whoever's passing you the notes, even though you've got no idea what the notes are saying and what you're saying. And this relates back to this monster in the book, because that's essentially what they do, but in terms of human emotion. So they sort of understand on an intellectual level what emotions are, what human emotions are, and they can reproduce them, but they don't feel them, kind of thing. They feel emotions of their own,
Interesting.
but the kind of pity and love and forgiveness, stuff like that, it's like a kind of rote learning thing for them almost. Yeah. So it goes
Wow.
quite deep into that sort of stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that is
It's quite a
fascinating.
dense book. Yeah. Some of
I'm sorry.
the I was going to say it's quite a dense kind of book. A lot of the biggest criticisms that I've had. It's only about 200 pages or so, 200 something. But uh, yeah, I think a lot of people found it a bit dense and impenetrable. Yeah, so there's a lot of this sort of stuff in it. Hopefully, there's a lot of action and blood and gore and a bit of humour as well.
Well, as I was reading your excerpts on
Aye.
Amazon, I kind of was getting a sense that it was deep and philosophical. Let's hold that for a second. I got one
Mm.
question before we move on to that, which is, do you touch at all on a catastrophe that might have hit Earth that caused this maybe downward spiral of civilization and then the splitting off of human races? Is that part of your book at all?
Yeah, it is. Um, I didn't. I didn't want. I wanted it to be fairly obvious that this was taking place on Earth and that it was in the future. And I kind of expected the reader to kind of assume that this is Earth, it's the far future, something terrible has happened, some great apocalypse has happened. Um, and I do, the book does reveal the nature of the apocalypse, but that's not really, it's not meant to be, the nature of the apocalypse is not meant to be a big reveal or anything, really. It's just a function of the plot. There is a kind of reveal at the end, which is a bit more interesting, maybe. But yeah, there's been a big an asteroid hit the Earth. That's all. That's all it is.
Okay.
Um, civilization was wiped out, um, and little pockets of humanity survived. That's the setup. That's the setup
Yeah.
of the story. Yeah, yeah,
Okay. So going back to something you'd mentioned earlier, they have this deity that they worship,
yeah.
but you also mentioned that it's a fantasy, but there's no real magic or anything. So is this deity actual a deity, or is it a fabrication, perhaps for social control or something like that?
Yeah, it's a fabrication, as in, or at least, um, there's no proof in the book that the god is real, kind of thing. Um, yeah, I just thought it'd be interesting to play with. Um, I mean, it's like Christianity has influenced Europe and America, and Islam has influenced the cultures of other parts of the world. I thought maybe tweak the religion and see what kind of um, society arises from it. So Jesus essentially Christianity is perfect. And so I thought, what if their God wasn't perfect? What if their God was kind of seen as um, imperfect and flawed and too busy to worry about the daily affairs of people, kind of thing. So that's the kind of God um, they worship. Um, why would you worship a God like that who doesn't care about you know what you do every day and doesn't care whether you win your school sports day and stuff? So
Yeah.
the kind of hook for them, I should probably mention, because a big asteroid hit the Earth, there's a great big ring around the Earth, like there is with Saturn, kind of thing. And that ring that's always there in the sky, that's obviously informed their religion as well. So um, the ring in the sky is seen as a bridge to heaven. It's called the Great Bridge and stuff like this. Um, and the idea is that if you live a good life, if your soul proves worthy through your life, that when you die, your soul crosses to heaven and fights with God in a kind of ultimate final battle against the forces of darkness kind of thing. So that's the kind of hook for them. And a sort of saying that people say, like goodbye derives from God be with you kind of thing. A phrase in the book is God hone your blade. And it's like God hone your blade for the final battle. And it's turned into like a shortened version, which is God alada, kind of like goodbye is a shortened version of God be with you, same sort of thing. Um, yeah,
Okay,
yeah, yeah, it's quite
interesting.
yeah. But there's
So
another
you
culture that's more
mentioned
multi-gods kind of stuff. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
okay. Well, so I was going to say, so in the excerpt again that I saw on Amazon, you mentioned that your characters face conflict with the sea and privation, deadly wildlife, and an enemy within. So, my question for you is then: is this a book about man versus man, or man versus nature, or man versus self? How would you pin this?
Oh, that's it. Man versus nature, man versus man. Uh, I'm tempted to say all three, but that sounds like, when someone goes on a chat show and says, my film is for everyone, if you like romance and comedy kind of thing.
I
But
mean,
I'd
it could be
say,
all three though if you're an amazing writer.
yeah, um, I'd say that man versus nature was the least of those, actually. What was the other one? Man versus man and man versus,
Self and man versus nature.
yeah. Um, yeah, probably self, actually. Probably, I'd say I'd say man versus self in that maybe the major kind of plot elements, the dramatic things that happen to steer the plot in different directions essentially result from human weakness kind of thing, from people making bad decisions or not being up to the task, or even in a sense having built a type of society which makes terrible courses of action inevitable. So if I had to pick one of those, I'd probably say man versus self. Man kind of screwing himself over because of how he's set up his society and because of just normal human fragility, really. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. And that
Okay,
probably does
interesting.
that probably does reflect the kind of dense Russian novel kind of philosophical bits in the book, I suppose.
Well, and that actually brings me up to my final question that I had written down again based off of what you wrote on Amazon. And
Yeah,
I know it's probably like 2:30 in the morning there for you right now, so I'll try and tie
yeah,
it up a
yeah.
little bit quickly.
That's cool. Then.
But you mentioned you have inspiration by your son's disability, and you also say, and I quote, "It is also an expression of my own hangups about being a productive member of society and how you
Yeah, yeah,
present yourself to the world at large." So,
yeah,
what
yeah.
exactly do you mean by that?
Oof, yeah. Well, let's start with my son's disability. He's got Down syndrome. Oh, fucking hell, there's the cat. And I've always been self-sufficient, never kind of expected help from anyone. Kind of that's my cat's tail. Uh, but having a child with a disability, suddenly your sort of notions of being a useful member of society kind of break down a little bit because you suddenly need help. You suddenly need a team of experts around your child, and without them, you'd be screwed, kind of thing. And this, particularly in Britain, where we've got the kind of socialised healthcare, what that means is that because all that stuff is so expensive, all that help, you are probably taking out of the system more than you're putting in. And so this notion about being useful as a member of society kind of played on my mind a bit. And so that translated into the book, I think, with this whole notion about the religion, where your soul has to prove itself in order to get to heaven. And that's it's a kind of, and especially with the torpor, the thing I said about where people have evolved to be able to go into this zombie-like state. People who've done that, people who've gone into that state, that's seen as them being inadequate. Their soul has proved too weak to go to heaven. So those people are regarded as doomed to oblivion, their souls, kind of thing. But as the story moves on, that taboo is forced to, it is stretched to breaking point by circumstance. Essentially, they're on this boat, stuff happens, people go into this torpor state, and they can't afford to still go along with that taboo anymore. They have to change their perceptions about usefulness to the wider society and stuff. It's not a direct, it's not a very direct thing that I can pinpoint, about my life and how it translates to the book, but it's a kind of feelings and vague thoughts about it, really. So that's the kind of my son's disability element of it. And you imagine, having a kid with a disability changes your perception on a lot of things, really, and just forces you to reevaluate. There's nothing particularly, surprising about that. But my own hang-ups, possibly the main one again, is I'm a terrible procrastinator. I put everything off to tomorrow. And that again fed into the whole torpor thing about being lazy. I probably didn't mention, actually. The religion in the book, their main virtues are kind of hard work and perseverance and vitality, kind of thing. And so that tapped into my insecurities, I suppose, again, about being useful and productive, because I kind of sometimes feel like I'm winging my way through life,
As we all do.
Yeah. And the whole thing about how you present yourself to the world, it probably touches on what I was talking about earlier with how they're called the unnamed, this sort of vampire-like species. And it goes into, there's a point where someone they thought was human turns out to be one of these creatures, which I call in the book the unnamed, on the basis that they don't, because of the kind of emotional vacuum in their brain, they don't even need to name themselves. They don't need to think of themselves in terms of having a name, because they're not a social species. Like a lion, it sounds stupid now, but a lion would probably give itself a name because it's part of a little community sort of thing. Whereas a leopard, a totally lone species, probably wouldn't give itself a name. What does a name mean to an isolated animal? And so one of the characters they think is a normal human turns out to be one of these creatures, and one of the main character actually interrogates this creature, and that's where we get all this philosophical stuff about the Chinese room experiment I was talking about earlier. And that touches on how you present yourself to the world, kind of thing, and maybe feelings of being a bit of an outsider through life, kind of thing. For me personally, feeling a bit of an outsider going through life, not in a kind of romantic or even dramatic way, just feeling a bit on the outside of things through life. Maybe that translated into the book in that way, really. So there's,
Well,
and
I have a comment
go
about
on.
that, which is I feel like a lot of creative people feel that kind of outsiderness that you're speaking of. And that's why
Yeah,
we're
maybe. Yeah.
creative. We want to reach out to other people that feel the same way as us or think the same way as us through our art in the hopes that we can connect with them. I think that's where that comes from.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, yeah. I do feel like, um, you know, it's a good way of expressing those things without just laying it all out to a therapist or something. Just,
Yeah.
just sort of turning it into something, getting it out. You know.
Yeah, they're
Yeah,
too
yeah. I think
expensive.
that's fine. Yeah, exactly. Mm.
All right. Well, before I let you go,
Mm.
does the procrastinator that actually finished a book have any final words to say?
Um, yeah, I guess I since I wrote the book, I think I started like everyone else, dreaming that some Netflix executive would offer me $10 million and produce a series. But I think if I'd make one plea to writers out there, it's just enjoy it as a hobby. Really, I get the feeling that like people who make pottery or people who paint or people who do a bit of acting down their local town hall production, they just enjoy it as a hobby. Doesn't mean they don't push themselves to do as good a job as they can, but it seems like writing is sort of obsessed with commercial success somehow. I think we should bring back writing as a fine pursuit in its own right, rather than a thing about, if you write, you've got to meet the right word count for your genre. Your audience won't want this, your publishers won't want that. You know, do the best job you can, but don't freak out about it. Think, the average potter or the average painter or the average sort of local actor doesn't spend 2 grand on an acting coach or someone to teach them to do pottery better. And yet, people who write their little novels and stuff spend thousands on editors and proofreaders and cover designers. Bring back writing as a hobby. That's what I say. That's what I'd like to say.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Thomas Norford. Let's see if the clapping works this time.
Hey, there we go. Chin chin. Thank you, Matt. That was a pleasure.
Absolutely.